For those that don't know me, yeah, I'm Greg. But look, the thing I wanted to talk about today is there's been this, when Power BI first came out, they had this sort of mantra that was 5 minutes to wow. And so I remember James Phillips saying, look, he really wanted people to be able to just connect up and within 5 minutes be going, this is awesome, right? And they did that, right? But the thing I find in enterprises is then people do that, and that was a great concept, but then they're like, what happens next, right? And so the problem we've run into is that you get people in an organization who start out trying it, do a bit of work with it and so on, and then they quickly start getting things done, but they don't know how to turn it into an enterprise thing. And the problem is the enterprises then look at what they're doing and they have this look on their face like they used to have with the first maybe access databases or something, you know, where they sort of look and go, yeah, it's kind of cool. And I never knock access because there's a lot of applications exist today that would never have existed, you know, if they hadn't started there. But then there was this problem, like how do you turn the things into enterprise applications? And exactly the same stuff is happening here right now. And it's a continual problem for the product group because they're balancing all the time. How do you add enterprise related features and not remove the convenience and ease of use that led to people loving it in the first place, right? So this is a real challenge for them to work out how to do this. But all I wanted to do is go through and tell you what we do at the moment. And so look, I head up SQL Down Under, which is no big deal, only a couple of us. And yeah, I've been I think it's my 20th time this time for a data platform MVP, if I get renewed overnight tonight, and been part of the RD program for about 15 years, which mostly just gets me on a whole lot of very interesting mailing lists internally in Microsoft. That's kind of what happens. And been around SQL Server since about 92, so forever, basically. And so look, a couple of things I really want to talk about. And so identity is number one. Now, this is something that I see people not sort out properly. Yet if you're going to head into this area and you're trying to make this work in an enterprise, you have to sort identity out, you know, and really early on. And so the thing you want is you want to have sort of a consistent single identity that works with your staff. Ideally, you want a hybrid identity that works on premises and in the cloud, if you have both, and most people do. And you want to be able to also work with your own applications or things that are Azure services that we're using. And I've started using the word Azure all the time now because it's the way they pronounce the product, even though I spent ages wanting to resist and call it Azure, but anyway. But if you also have software as a service offerings, you kind of want it to work with that as well. Otherwise, you end up with this horrible password proliferation type problem that occurs. And look, so many organizations I do work for, you know, by the time I get connected to do work, sometimes I've logged in 5 and 6 times, you know, to get to the point where I can actually do things and so on. And the number of places where I have to log on and different identities and different applications and things, it's a mess, right? And this is a really common problem where people haven't sorted this out. And so you might also need to integrate with partners. And so if I'm doing work for superannuation company A in Melbourne, the traditional way they would give me access is they would set me up an account, which was, you know, Greg Lowe at superannuationcompanya.com. And that's how they would set it up. And then everything I would do was with that identity. But that sort of thing becomes quite messy again, because that's yet another identity. And if there's multiple people from the one organization, you're also dealing with those all individually, and that's a bit of a pain. And the other one that you might have to deal with, of course, is having an identity system for consumers or customers or members or things like that. And people often have yet another identity system where they start to sort of tie that sort of thing in. And so you really need to have thought through this and try and avoid it. Now, the starting point most people today seem to start with is they'll have Active Directory on premises or hosted in some data center. And that's the thing, that the SQL Server is a member server in that directory. And as soon as they add Office 365 or Power BI or something else into that mix, then all of a sudden you've got Azure Active Directory as the identity that it wants. And now that works fine. And so, but the Power BI service will know you as that identity. And if we have things like Office 365 and so on, it knows you as that identity as well. But then you get, of course, the Power BI service wants to get information from the SQL Server box or something like that. So then we start trying to sort of tie these together. And the initial starting point that most people then do is they might set up AD Connect, which is a good option. And that gives you the ability to have a hybrid identity. So I can have an identity down in Active Directory here. And when I look in Azure Active Directory, it'll show me as a Windows user who's a member of that directory as well. And I can be given permissions and do things with that as well. Now, the other thing that's kind of nice about that, if you haven't done a lot of work with Azure Active Directory, the other thing is it has a nice branding story. So you can do things like, customize all the login screens and things. So it really does look like a corporate thing rather than just looking like some standard Microsoft offering. But in addition to that, it's got a whole lot of additional stuff you can do with it. And of course, we can also have identities that just live in that directory as well. And when we have groups, again, we have groups down in Active Directory, but we can have groups in Azure Active Directory, and they can include groups from Active Directory as well. So, I mean, you have a whole variety of things you can do there. Don't underestimate, though, even just the power of being able to have that in place. I see some people who just do one-way syncs and things from on-premises Active Directory to Azure. I try and encourage them to the equivalent of what used to be federation, but nowadays is a sort of a bi-directional sync. And I have, for example, a good example, a car distributor, manufacturer who now only distributes in Australia, but they had, say, 200 dealers across the country. And if you look at how the dealers used to connect to their systems and things, they used to all connect in via VPNs, and they'd be managing identities. Actually, it was about 400 dealers, and they were managing identities and stuff like that for those people. And if you look at what their IT people did, an enormous amount of their time was dealing with identity issues, right? And dealing with, this dealer can't log on, or that person at that dealer can't log on, and so on. And they're dealing with all that sort of mess. I have to tell you, the minute they put in the hybrid identity, they put the dealers and stuff connecting into that, and they put things like cloud-based password reset in place, the vast majority of that disappeared. Right? So immediately they're in a position that's way, way stronger. And of course, the staff prefer that as well, once they can fix all those sort of problems themselves. But the bigger issue with it is that the identity there can be the identity system for lots of other applications. And so if you have other software as a service applications, they can use that same identity. So if you had Dropbox in place, or you have, Zendesk for a help desk, or any of these things, you'll find the vast majority of them will be able to use that as the identity system. And so instead of you, again, logging on to your own systems, and then when you go to Zendesk or something going with yet another set of credentials, this is then, able to avoid that, and you can have the same identity system right through that as well. It's so important to get that sort of thing sorted out. Then the other thing is that when the Power BI service connects down, the first thing most people do is just set up a gateway on a member server and then let it get to the SQL Server box. But again, you've got to be thinking, what is the identity that the Power BI service is connecting to that database as? And in most of the cases when people are doing this, they're using a fixed identity out of the Power BI service to go and get the data out of the SQL Server. And again, that's not exactly really where we want to be either. Right? So we really want the identity coming down and being sort of part of like a row level security and so on there. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. But what we tend to do is we try and aim eventually to get Azure Active Directory to be the primary directory, more so going forward, even though everybody today we'll still think of the on-premises AD as the primary directory, but increasingly it'll be the primary directory. And the more they add things like domain services and so on into Azure AD, the more you'll be able to use that just as the primary directory. If we have existing ones, most places do, then we use AD Connect, as I mentioned. But the other thing we do is we try and encourage them when they have partners or contractors or other people coming in, that they connect them up using Azure AD B2B. So there's an option in Azure AD where we do business-to-business connectivity. And the ability in that means that instead of me becoming greg@somesuperannuationcompany.com, they can take my greg@SQLdownunder.com and they can just add me to their directory. And they can then put me into groups, they can assign me permissions, they can do all those sort of things, but I keep my same identity, right, the whole way along. And that sort of simplifies things for the partners and contractors dramatically. It also means that if they decide that I've had enough of those guys, we want to get rid of them, you know, they can just turn off our company from a B2B point of view, and then we all disappear. You know, instead of them having to go through and trying to remember what are all these accounts they need to nuke and so on, that all disappears. Now, if you then have customers and members and so on, you need a directory system for them. Don't rule out, there's also B2C, so business to consumer. This is another part of Azure AD. And what that'll allow you to do is have thousands and thousands of people actually per paid user in the primary directory, but you can use that as the membership system for your customers, members, and so on. Now, in terms of the tools, we use Azure AD, we do branding and stuff in that, use cloud-based password reset, and we use a lot of role-based access control. And so this is within Azure AD, this is at the level of who is able to do what with the Azure resources. That's really what that fits in. And so, for example, they'll have Timbermill I'm doing work with at the moment. They have basically just added my normal identity into their system, and then they've set me with roles in their Azure subscriptions and things, and I can do things just like I'm a member in there, and so works a treat. And, you know, you can also still tie it down to, you know, IP whitelists and those sorts of things. I mean, you can tie it down further as well. The other one that's really important to get comfortable with are managed service identities. So if you've got applications like Azure Data Factory, which is being used to move data around as an example, you don't want to be configuring SQL logins and things to get to the databases when you're using that. What you can do instead is you can take the service's identity, which is a managed service identity, and you can give it permissions in various spots. And so that's actually much, much better than I see a proliferation where people are still whacking SQL logins and things all over the place to get around that sort of problem. We use B2B and B2C, as I said, and if the company needs to expose APIs, so maybe I've got a web interface that people need to be able to call in to do something. Again, there's an API management tool that works with the same identity system. And so you can control who can get to which APIs, you can throttle the behavior of them and so on, log all the access to it. It's actually really sweet. And then finally, once you start moving sort of more cloud-based, of course, you're going to want to be able to store things like a file system and maybe have places that people drop things in and pick things up from. Well, again, storage we use Azure Storage. Storage Explorer is a good tool for getting to that. And at the moment, most of the access that we provide to third parties of things is via basically SaaS URIs. So these are shared access signatures. And so this is the way we give them permission. So if somebody has to drop a file in a folder or something like that. What is coming, hopefully, you know, it's been coming for a while, but things like SFTP implementations over the top of Azure Storage and so on, you know, I'm sort of hopeful that will appear in a reasonable time frame as well, because that would fix another whole class of problems that we don't currently have good solutions for. Now, the next thing is loading and transforming the data that we work with. Now, so if you look at what you need to have a good outcome with Power BI, is you need to have a really clean data model that you're building the analytics over the top of. And it's something that always feels a little strange to the relational database people. It's got to be 100% focused on analytics, not on the relational stuff. And so one of the problems with this is you might have all the internal rules about this is how we build relational databases and here are all our rules and so on. And then you look at the way people want to build the analytic ones and it feels sort of like unclean, or something in terms of how they want. But you've got to focus, on what the analytics needs, not the basic sort of stuff that you'd normally do with a relational database. And also, you've got to get yourself comfortable with, by the time it goes out to those tools, you're going to have things like human readable columns and things that are directly presentable and so on, which are not things most people would want in a normal relational database. But the other big thing you have to do, of course, is the cleansing and validation. I would say in probably most BI projects, anybody would tell you, any serious project, probably 80, 90% of the work is cleaning the data and getting it validated and getting it in the right shape. But you might also need to have multiple source systems for the analytics. This can be critical, so you're often still having to align data from different places. And you might also need to do versioning of the data. This is something people often don't think about until too late. But for example, if I have a whole lot of customers who are in sales territories, and then I decide to rearrange all the sales territories, the question is, what happens when I look at reports on last year's sales? So have they suddenly morphed into the new sales territories? Or does last year's report still look like last year's report, right? And so on. So you've got to make decisions about what's going to happen in terms of versioning. Now, one of the questions that comes up all the time is people say, yeah, do you need to build a separate data warehouse database in there? And there's a thing called Bettridge's law. I don't know if anyone knows what Bettridge's law is, but it's a thing that says whenever you see a headline, particularly in the internet, that asks a leading question, the answer is always no, right? But in this case, it's yes, right? I think you absolutely have to do this. I see examples all the time where people don't do it and it's a mess, right? So if you could, in theory, with a lot of the tools today, go and build your analytics over the top of existing relational systems, right? Sounds good in theory. You usually get poor outcomes when you do that. You often have lousy code that's involved in the transformation, and a lot of that's being done very much on the fly. And you also tend to lack sort of good code reuse on that transformation. So I'll see people who build 10 reports and they're fixing the data in all 10 of those reports, this sort of thing. I mean, this is not where you want to be. You don't want to be doing that. And so they tend to also get inconsistent outcomes. So they'll build a report that does a calculation one way, and then they'll build another report that does a calculation a different way, even though it's the same calculation. And so that sort of thing can lead to a sort of a dueling reports argument at the beginning of meetings and things. And so the other big one, of course, is it can lead to performance issues. Nobody will thank you if you have sort of massive analytic overhead pounding your relational database to death. Now, there's things that have improved in the relational space to help with this. Clustered column store indexes, I think, have been a real godsend for this. I would say it's interesting when I look at SQL Server back in 2014, I actually thought clustered column stores were the best thing in the box, right, in SQL Server 2014. And when I was talking to the marketing people, I was struggling to get them to even mention them. All they wanted to talk about was, in-memory OLTP and things like that. And I kept looking and going, this is awesome, and it's not something they just wanted to talk about. I often think I have a very different opinion to them as to what's important. But that was the best thing in the box by far in 2014. Now, when they added the ability to have non-clustered column stores that were writable, updatable in 2016, that was another good, complete part of that story. And they also added the ability to have delayed roll-up into the segments in the clustered column store. So, for example, you could have a table that you were working on, and it wouldn't try and roll that up into the column store because that would be horrible. and you could set a delay on that, and then maybe until a row hadn't been touched for something like 10 minutes or something, it could get rolled up, or 40 minutes or whatever the thing was. But you could then get pretty good performance over those sort of queries. But you still have the basic problem that you're not doing the same job in terms of cleaning the data up and so on. And so there's basic problems like source systems. I mean, naming is obviously a classic. I mean, this is one that I came across a while back, and the columns on the left here, these are the names of the tables, right? And for the life of me, I couldn't work out, well, I eventually worked out what they were, the things on the right, but the thing is, it was far from obvious, you know, what that was. And I wondered if it was intentionally obscure or something. I'm not sure, because it certainly didn't fit any language that made any sense to me. Also the schema design, right? You look at this immediately and you think, oh, that's a table. No, that was the clustered index on the table, right? And so you just look and go, no, I don't think so. You know, so this is not the sort of stuff you want to bring into your data warehouse. And then there's invalid data, you know, where things look pretty good, but like Monday night here, a little hot, right? So it's like something's gone wrong in that data somehow. And what fascinates me, it's often these weather places at the worst case of this. I don't know what it is with them. But things like this is off the Theos homepage, you know, where last update, 2014, you know, as a year. Okay, it's a long time in the future. And then you have missing data, right? And so what happens when the data is missing? Now, this system shows all nines, right? And so you get to find out what happens. But again, it'd be good if this was cleaned up, because immediately it makes whatever you build over the top of it just look like nonsense. And then sometimes the data's there, but it's not real. So like I look at this one and the temperatures, they're all the same number, and there's some ballistically large number. But you see the same thing with maybe postcodes where they had to have one, but every postcode is 9999, you know, or something like that. So things will have gone wrong in the data along the way. Rounding issues are classics. I love this actually, where currently the 100, you have 0% chance of winning. You know, it's the most true thing I've ever seen. You know? And of course, I'm sure when the guy tested, or whoever built this tested it, they probably had less than 100 players in the draw, so they got back, you know, valid-looking integers or whatever. But the minute they had more than 100 people in it, then all of a sudden you had no chance of winning. So yeah, okay. But you see rounding issues and things all the time, you know, in data. So look, what we do is we start with whatever they have in terms of source databases, and they're often nothing like what we want them to be, right? So this is an example of a system called AccuCell. The tables, again, I think they probably came from Access, so they've got like TBL in the front of all these. You know, the design is some sort of rec ID thing, and I mean, the names they're not stupidly horrible, you know, but they're not something I'd want to put in an analytics system, right? And so you'll have sort of naming issues. You'll have often poor choices of data types. So for example, this one down here, track quantity, that's actually a Boolean thing. And so that's actually, they've used a small int for that, you know, rather than say a bit, for example, and so on. So you'll get this sort of thing. And of course you'll get inconsistent design, because what you'll find is a column that's used for something is a certain size one place and a completely different design or size or something in a different part. I just don't want to bring this into the work I'm doing. You know, I want to leave that behind if I can. And so my preference is to try and get a cloud-based database to start with. Now, this is not always possible, and it depends on how comfortable the customer is with it and so on. But a really, really common thing that we'll do is if they have an on-premises SQL Server database that they're working with, we will often try and sort of pick up and build a replica of that, often using transactional replication. So it's got this new lease on life, actually. And so we do that with a push subscription. And so what you can do is you can have a normal SQL Server database on premises. You can push that up to an Azure SQL database with a push subscription. And that is a great way to centralize this sort of data. To give you an example, I've got people who had, say, pet stores all over the country. They have a couple of hundred pet stores. They used to connect from all the stores, again, via VPNs into the head office and so on. There's a world of difference when as soon as we picked up and put replicas of all those databases in the cloud. And the nice thing with that too is, of course, now they've got a proper copy of the data sitting in the cloud as well all the time. And then we're able to build a data warehouse that just connects to all those replicas, and we're not messing around with the source system, you know, and interfering with that while we're doing the work. And so we're doing work with timber mills at the moment. And again, they've got timber mills all over the country. They've got systems that must stay on premises because they're literally part of the timber process and so on. But again, we pop replicas of those up into the cloud, and then we do the work on it up there. And that's turned out to be a really, really good outcome. Now, the first thing that we do in terms of building schemas and stuff, we do tend to have stuff in different schemas. We build a DataLoad schema, and we used to call it integration, but same sort of thing. What it is it's a schema that holds all the objects that are just used in terms of moving stuff around and knowing where you're up to, right? So it's the kind of integration control type layer sitting in that. So we don't have user data in there. We'll have configuration data sometimes in there, but on some systems, we'll also have metadata related objects in there as well. So for example, if you look over here, I've got a thing called external tables in the top right. And what that is a table that has details of the columns that I want from the tables from those external source systems. And so we detail that down into a table, and then we have, for example, once we stage the data in, we have staging indexes here, design metadata wise, and then we'll have this one down the bottom, like refresh external and staging object. That'll go off and rebuild all of the tables, the external data sources, the external tables, all of that stuff. And so we try and do as much of that as we can in a metadata driven way. I do not want to be sitting there, you know, building and looking after and, you know, testing. And that way you just get a really consistent outcome, you know, by doing that. The next thing we normally drop in there is we have our own tools that a lot of people have. So it's just SDU tools. They're free. Just go to the site and grab them. And so what that does is it has a huge number of utility functions and things. So if I need a proper case function or a title case function or something that trims white space properly, or if I need to nuke all the contents of a schema, or if I need to print big long messages immediately, or, you know, it just goes on and on. But importantly, things like date dimensions. I don't have to go back and rebuild all the functions for columns for date dimensions or periods within a day or any of those sort of functions. So we've just got, there's literally, I think, nearly hundreds of them now in there, but things that just do stuff that I don't want to be sitting there writing the code for again. Then we have a staging schema, and what we try and do with that, again, this is usually, this is in the data warehouse database. It can be, as I said, in Azure SQL database, but it can be on premises too. But what we're trying to do is go and get the data, just the bits we need to be able to do the analytic work. And so what we do with that is we tend to have a staging schema. Note the table names and the column names and the data types are exactly the same as what they were in the source system. But what we do with that is it's usually a subset. So it's only some tables, it's only some columns in those tables and so on, and we find just the bits we want. But we want it to be a place where we can bring this into our data warehouse in the staging as cleanly and with the least possible chance of it breaking. Because I don't want transformations and things at this stage to be sort of, you know, running off and causing all sorts of problems in the staging. I just want that to be smooth. And that proc I mentioned before and our metadata-driven ones, it builds all those tables and it builds the code that loads them. All right. So it also, we access the tables via external tables. So if you haven't played around with these in Azure SQL Database, you don't have a concept of linked servers and things anymore. What you have is you have external tables and external data sources. So an external data source is just basically a pointer that says this is how you connect to that server over there. It can be an Azure SQL server. And then the external tables, what we do is we build out a table that relates to that table that's over there in the source system. But this is not actually a table, even though it's called an external table. It's more like a view over the top of that table that's over there in that other database. And so, but what it gives us within our database is a thing that looks like their table with the subset of columns and stuff like that. And then we can use that to write all the queries that we do to load into the staging one. And so again, we auto build all of that stuff as well. In terms of the thing that we're aiming for though, is we tend to build a data model schema. And so this is, we used to build like DIMs and facts and stuff. We don't do that anymore. And we used to build them as schemas rather than prefixes and so on. But again, we don't tend to do that. But usually what's going on here is this is quite different to the source system. So this is the cleaned up, you know, consistent naming, consistent data types. There's a lot of stuff I could write about, like, you know, the rules we use for how to do that. And it's something, all of these things, I find it's something that just takes practice over time to get good at. I'm mentoring a few guys that do this sort of work at the moment. And, you know, again, the first times they're doing it, you know, it's just not great, you know, the stuff that comes out. But the aim is to get things really, really consistent and across the models. Now, in some customers, we're also doing a whole bunch of these models. And so it's often not just the one model. We're trying to get some consistency across the different data models as well. And so at that point, though, the relationships and so on will be based on single column keys. So the things that are the identifiers for those tables will be called key at that stage. But again, they'll be ints or big ints. It'll be really cleaned up, ready to go with something that'll work nicely inside the analytic tools. And so then we build an analytics schema over the top of that. And so this is the, for us, this is the human presentable layer. And so what happens is we create a schema called analytics, and the objects that are in here are what Power BI or analysis services or any of those sort of tools get to connect to. Okay? They don't get to go anywhere near anything else in the database. So what we do is we give the user that, say, analysis services connects as, it only has permission to execute and select on that one schema. Right? Because I don't want any of the cloud-based things and so on to have permissions to get into the database beyond that, right? Now, because a lot of people sort of, again, worry about yet another copy and what can it do with that identity and so on. It's the same thing I find all the time. If we have websites that we're building, I see people all the time who build websites, and if you look at how it connects to the database, invariably it's a DB owner or it's a data reader, data writer, or something like that. And it's a horrible idea, right? What you want, I mean, it's okay if you're happy for the day that things get trampled on, you just, you know, it's a free-for-all over the whole lot of your data. But ideally what I prefer is to have a schema for that website, and it has no objects in it, but all it has are views and procs, and that's the only thing I let that website go anywhere near. Because when the website gets trampled on, which it will one day, that's going to define the entire list of things that somebody can do through that identity in the website. And we've used the same sort of rationale here. So I don't want, you know, be analysis services, be Power BI, whatever. I don't want it to get to anything else and have no chance of it. Now, the naming in this is completely ready to go on reports, tabular models, Power BIs, things like that. What we do, they all tend to be human readable names, except the keys. This is something I know Marco does the same sort of thing, but we tend to keep the keys not like that, and they end up being hidden in all of the models anyway, generally anyway. But all the rest of the columns are ready to go. So this means that if I connect in a reporting tool, then I can just drag those columns straight on and they're ready to use. If I build a tabular model, it's already ready to use from that perspective. And importantly, it's consistent across the whole thing. And if it ends up in Power BI, again, I'm not in there renaming all these things.
We have a really good question, actually, and
yes.
because it is my question. Do you have in your tools that you highlighted before, is there anything that can help to build the views on top of tables that the columns?
Actually, we do. Actually, no, I lie. There's a function in there that takes a Pascal case name and puts spaces in between the words and stuff. There is a function in there that does that. And so we should use that as I could use that as part of the logic for building that. It's another one of the things I've been meaning to automate, but haven't quite yet.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. But as I said, this is also the security boundary for the analytic tools. All right. So then in the tabular model, we bring the analytics views in, we create hierarchies where they need to be. Obviously, we'll have common measures, but we'll only put in there measures that are useful on more than a handful of reports, so we tend not to put measures in there if they're for one particular report. What we do, I don't know if it's mentioned here. Yeah, I do. Add an extra empty table in there, usually called something like report measures or something like that. And what that'll do is that'll end up as a table in, say, Power BI that people can then attach the measures that are specific to the report onto. But it's just giving them kind of like an anchor to attach things. As I said, we hide the key columns, we set appropriate formatting, because I find if you don't do that, there's just so many things that don't quite work right. I was surprised the other day when I found that the default format, for example, for a date time column, when it gets into Power BI, is just a date, right? And that's because they only have a date time data type, and they've chosen that date is the default way that gets displayed. But the thing is, if you had a date time column back in an analytic model and you're trying to use that in Power BI, that's a bit of a problem, right? That sort of thing. So we often end up with formatting and stuff set in there. And this is also where we'll often set things like column sort orders. And I would also say, do not summarize, things like that tends to get set at this point in the model. It's also then where we build the row level security. So we'll build the roles and we'll often get involved in what those roles can do, but we won't get involved in who's in the roles, right? So I figure that's nothing to do with me. Right? All right, so then when we get into Power BI, we tend to use live query connections for pretty much all the enterprise type stuff. So, I mean, you could obviously do import for certain things and so on. We just tend not to, and now the alternative to that, of course, is to potentially use Power BI Premium instead of analysis services. Just today, I'm looking at David going, you know the same story. It's like the licensing for that is just, there's just no comparison, it's I mean, I would love to be able to drop Power BI Premium in there instead, but it just in so many sites, I just simply can't justify that today, based upon the licensing. But you could still use it the same way down the track if that's what you did instead. We add report-specific measures in there and, of course, obviously design the visualizations. And in many, many situations, it'll be some wonderful person from the customer sites who ends up doing a whole lot of the work on the visualizations. Once you present them with a lovely, clean data model and so on to work with, I mean, it's invariably you find someone who'll just run off and keep going. Who'll do a great job of it. As the timber stuff I was just mentioning, I had a really good look through the ones one of the guys there did, and I had a look at that yesterday. I was just amazed with the quality of what he'd done. It was awesome. And so, I mean, we can have a go at it, but they know what they really need. So if you put them in a position where they really can do it, it's surprising. Most places will have somebody who'll do a great job of that. Alrighty, it helps if they also don't mind a little bit of DAX, right? And so that's like. Now, another one is that reporting services might be part of the solution, right? And so I find it's still particularly useful for operational reporting. So the hint on this is that if you're getting requests that say, can you reprocess the model, every half hour or something like that, you're heading in the wrong territory, right? I mean, we've done that for some models and, we have to do intricate work with, usually with petitions and things to get to a point where that works properly. And so there's nothing that says you can't do that. and it's an upside of using analysis services because you control when that all happens. But the thing is, it feels at that point like if you're doing operational reporting, reporting services is still a great way of doing that, right? The thing that amazes me is, I love the Mark Twain thing with the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated, but the thing with reporting services is it's still the best option for all sorts of things around paginated reports, particularly shared data sources. And the minute you start doing anything tricky with subscriptions or where we had data-driven subscriptions, you know, I was at a site today where they were looking at, you know, how do I send out a CSV, you know, to people on a regular basis via a subscription. And I just look at them and go, you know, they were talking about the most convoluted ways you can imagine. And you just look and go, you know, this is what this thing does, you know, is this sort of stuff. Like, do not rule it out, right, as part of a solution. And I get very frustrated at the moment where I often go to sites and the local Microsoft Cloud Architect people have been in and they're all going poo-poo over reporting services like they don't want to see it as part of the solution. Yet the stuff they're suggesting is so convoluted as a way of getting around having it. Well, sorry, you know, like, I mean, it still has a place. Look, they're building better and better support for paginated reports directly in Power BI Premium. That might be an option for some people, but there's a ton of stuff that still doesn't do that reporting services does much, much easier. Right? That might change. So anyway, so look, in terms of tools, SQL database, transactional replication, our SDU tools, Azure analysis services, or maybe if it's on premises, SQL Server analysis services. If we're using analysis services, then it'll be SSDT and Tabular Editor and probably DAX Studio as part of that. And if we're moving data around, if it's on premises, it'll still be integration services. If it's something that's happening somewhat cloud-based, it'll be Azure Data Factory that we're using instead. Now, in terms of project management, I'm trying to always have repeatable processes, decent options and source code integration. I want good support for multiple environments. I want to be able to deal with dev and test and, you know, prod and so on, that sort of stuff effortlessly. Now, I might also want, of course, DevOps integration in various ways, or project management like boards and so on, or testing frameworks. So what we do today, we tend to use Azure DevOps projects. And so I've got one here called Lean Perfection. And we tend to build a number of set repositories. So we'll have a repository in there for the database project. We'll have one for the data factory. And Azure Data Factory will be directly connected to that DevOps repository. And we'll have one for the tabular data model. We potentially would have one in there if there's a reporting services model as well. All right. Now, so the tools in that, so database projects, we try and use template-based deployments if we can, and boards is okay. It's not great, but for project task management, but it's workable. Now, one of the things that's also happening here at the moment is, of course, you'll notice that Microsoft has bought GitHub, you know, a couple of years ago. So there's a really big push at the moment that everything suddenly has become GitHub-based, and they're sort of seeing Azure DevOps as having sort of a sunset somewhere in the way. You know, it's still a very messy story, that story. Look, it's fairly inevitable because I think GitHub probably has 100 customers for every customer that DevOps has, right? So I mean, so the thing is that it's going to happen that way in some way. But to me at the moment, Azure DevOps is still the most compelling story. And the other thing is simply cost. Here in Australia, I think it's about $9 a head for Azure DevOps. It's about 25 or 26 for GitHub Enterprise. And so I look at the two and go, don't know. And GitHub Enterprise currently does less, right? So it doesn't have boards and doesn't have, if you get GitHub Enterprise, they give you an Azure DevOps license so you can use those other things. And look, these will all merge down the track. So I think eventually the pipelines will get replaced with pipelines that are based on GitHub Actions and so on. If you're just starting out, look, you might want to start to get your head around GitHub, but I mean, basically the Azure DevOps repos and the repositories are Git-based repositories anyway. So it's not going to be a big deal if you decide at some point to move. Moving the pipelines will probably be a little more work, but they keep saying they'll make that as seamless as they can. Now, some of the things that might help there are the Redgate tools and around the DevOps. They're doing great work in that compared to anybody else I'm seeing. I still see people, if they want to do unit tests, there's still been no great stuff for database unit tests. I really wish there were. I mean, T-SQL-T and some of these things do a pretty good job, but I still prefer just to basically build an NUnit or similar test project or test projects in .NET, and I just wrap my procs and views and stuff with unit tests that are built on that. And as I said, you may end up with GitHub and GitHub Actions. Now, in terms of data security, so the must-haves for me is obviously preventing inappropriate access. Everything you want to be doing is role-based, not user-based, and I want to integrate with the on-premises stuff and the groups and the cloud-based things wherever I can. Another one that sometimes I need is dynamic role membership. That's possible. So the idea here is I might want to build a role that says all of the state managers are members of that role, but I want to programmatically determine who the state managers are, right? That sort of thing. So, I mean, there's nothing to stop you writing code that queries Active Directory on premises, and you can go off and hit the REST interfaces and things on Azure Active Directory, and you can query it to do that. Sometimes that's better than having to somebody have maintain lists of those, but most organizations are going to have somebody in the place who worries about who salespeople are and who they aren't and who managers are and so on. And fortunately, that's not me. So,
hi, Dave. Sorry. Yep. We have a question for Dave Orm. I think related to a section before.
So CI/CD stuff, I see that. Yeah, look, we do that for the database stuff at the moment, but I wish I could easily do that for things like the tabular data model and so on. Not so easy at the moment. The tabular editor stuff and the integration with that and the way you can use that to store objects as sort of broken down things in folders and stuff is a great start, right, along that line. Yeah, but there's still serious work to be done in that. Unfortunately, there's still a few things there that are just a bit more manual than I'd like them to be, today. The other thing is that normally when we're deploying out that way, I would like to be able to run through a pipeline through different environments and so on. Now, with the premium, Power BI premium stuff, they've just done some work on deployment across into different environments and stuff. It's okay, kind of what they've done, but the issue I have with that is they've basically built something that's very Power BI specific and really doesn't fit back into standard Azure DevOps pipelines and GitHub Actions and things like that. I kind of keep telling them they need to do that. So I don't know quite where that'll be sort of coming out as well. But anyway, we'll see. But as I said, row level security, normally you would do that in Azure Analysis Services or in Power BI Premium. And the groups and stuff there that can be obviously AAD groups if it's in cloud, or just AD groups if it's an on-premises one. Now, when you configure a gateway, if you have an on-premises analysis services, the other thing you have to sort of check is who the identity is as it comes through the gateway. And I'll sort of mention a bit about that in a minute. And as I said, for some clients, we do dynamic stuff. But the tools, Azure Analysis Services, we still use quite a lot. And potentially, as I said, Power BI Premium, where the licensing suits. And the AD groups, both on-premises and in AD. Now, look, in terms of the end game, if we have a client who's very cloud-friendly, or particularly cloud-friendly, we'll normally end up with something that looks like this. So the SQL Server, if it ends up staying on-premises, if it can go to the cloud, even better, right? I'm happy with that. But if it's staying on-premises, we'll often use transactional replication to push that into an Azure SQL database, and there may be multiples of these as a source. We'll use Azure Data Factory there to pull that data across into a data model, that's loaded up, and all of that processing then and done in Azure Analysis Services. The row-level security is implemented there, and the live query is the thing that goes off and hits the Power BI service. And so ideally then we have a single identity right through the whole thing, and that's what's used for the identity. If we have a customer who's a little more uncomfortable with the data living like totally cloud-based, what we often have is a transactional database that will end up with integration services or something populating a data warehouse. Again, integration services will be involved in doing the processing into analysis services, where we'll have row-level security. And then we'll have a member server in here that has a gateway connection. And again, we can do exactly the same sort of things with a live query and so on from Power BI up here. As I said, the only thing you've got to sort of watch there is that when it connects down, the issue is who is the user. Now, it actually gives you one extra option here, is that sometimes I've seen people start their Azure Active Directory with a different directory name to what they have on premises. The nice thing in the gateway is you can map individual users if you must, but you can also do a UPN mapping that says everywhere you see abc.com, make that abcxyz.com.au, and you can have that mapping occur automatically in the gateway as long as you've added the additional UPN suffix in Active Directory so that those people can be known as the other name and stuff as well. That works a treat as well. And so there's a couple of different ways you can do that, but it tends to still give you, as I said, I'm pretty happy with the outcome that we tend to get with that. And so look, that's all I really wanted to talk about, just to give you a feel for what most of those projects look like. And so contact details, and we have an area on the site called free stuff. Feel free, there's ebooks and things and the podcast and stuff there, and my blog's there. We've got some training already in place. We've got an enterprise Power BI class coming. It's the equivalent of what would be about a 5-day, normally full-time class. So it'll be a fairly substantial one. And that'll probably be available in pieces as well, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, guys, stay safe. Darren and myself, we're really glad that you joined this meeting, Greg, and you got involved. Actually, when I was looking for a speaker, we were looking for a speaker a couple of months ago. You were one of the first one, pretty much, who raised the hand and said, "Hey, I'm here to help." And actually, the session has been amazing. Thank you.
Terrific. All good. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Greg.